Moving into a new home was both a joyous occasion and a challenge for the Bennett family. For too long, they had been living in small rented apartments, cramped and overcrowded with things that had accumulated over the years. When the opportunity to buy their own home appeared on the horizon, it seemed like a miracle. Jack and Sarah, a couple who had endured financial hardships, considered it a reward for all their sacrifices. They found the house on the internet. The old Victorian mansion with its large windows, pointed gables, and magnificent carvings on the door looked like it had come out of a dream. Even with some minor damage to the facade and a slightly neglected state, it looked decent. The price was so low that Jack and Sarah suspected a trick at first. But the realtor they met during the first inspection assured them that the reason was only the old age of the house and the unwillingness of the previous owners to invest in its repair. When the family arrived for the inspection, the house was covered in a light fog that drifted in from the forest behind it. The tall trees that framed the property resembled guards keeping a watchful eye on their domain. There was perfect silence around, only occasionally interrupted by the singing of distant birds. But Sarah immediately felt that there was something strange about this place. An inexplicable coolness passed over her skin, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the excitement of taking a big step in their lives. The house had 3 floors, many rooms, and an attic that seemed to be waiting for its secret. The children, Emily and Tom, were thrilled that they would now each have their own room. Tom, the younger of the two, even declared that he would be the first to go up to the attic to see what was there. Sarah smiled, although the anxiety in her heart had not disappeared. She felt her fingers gently squeeze Jack's hand, looking for support. He just winked at her, telling her that everything would be fine. The first days after the move were chaotic. Everything needed to be unpacked, furniture needed to be arranged, and the old windows and doors creaked slightly, as if protesting the intrusion of new residents. Sarah tried to distract herself from her feelings by focusing on everyday life. However, she noticed that she was constantly feeling like she was being watched. The living room deserved special attention. The large room with a fireplace that had not been used for a long time looked both luxurious and gloomy. The wallpaper, which had once been golden, now had a dark yellow hue, and it seemed that the walls were absorbing light. Sarah often found herself standing in the center of the room, looking at every corner, but she couldn't put her finger on what was bothering her. One evening, when the children had fallen asleep, Sarah decided to have tea in the living room. Jack was unpacking boxes in the other room, so she was alone. She sat on the old sofa, looking at the fireplace, which seemed to breathe in and out deeply with her. At that moment, she noticed for the first time that the room was covered in a strange silence. Even the sounds of the wind, which usually came from outside, disappeared. Sarah stood up, but felt her legs feel heavy. An unpleasant feeling gripped her, but she forced herself to look at the window. A handprint was clearly visible on the foggy glass. It was large and looked as if it had been left by someone outside, although Sarah knew that no one could have been outside the window. She took a few steps back, feeling her heart speed up. When she looked away for a moment and then looked again, the print was gone. The children started complaining about strange noises. Tom said he heard someone walking in the hallways at night. Emily claimed to have seen a silhouette in her room, but it disappeared as soon as she turned on the light. Sarah tried to reassure them, but her own fear only grew. She tried to talk to Jack, but he just shrugged his shoulders and said that the house was old, and old houses always make noises. One morning, while sorting through boxes in the dining room, Sarah noticed that the table they had placed in the middle of the room had moved to the side. She was sure that none of them could have done it, because only yesterday Jack and she had spent hours putting the furniture in all the rooms. She moved it back, but the next morning it was in a different place again. These little things kept piling up. One night, She and Jack heard someone knocking on their bedroom door at night. When Jack opened the door, there was no one there. Though he blamed it on drafts, Sarah knew that wasn't the case. She started closing the doors to each room, hoping that would stop whatever was bothering them. The worst part was that the children were becoming more and more withdrawn. Tom no longer ran around the house like he used to, but sat in his room and drew something on paper. One day, Sarah found his drawing and shuddered. It was a house, their house, but there were figures standing around it, dark, blurry, and like shadows. They looked like they were watching the house, surrounding it on all sides. When Sarah asked what they were, Tom said they were friends who come at night. Emily had also changed. She used to wake up at night screaming, but she could never explain what she was dreaming about. Her room was the smallest, but now she refused to sleep there. One day, Sarah walked in and felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The room was colder than all the others, even when the radiators were on. The house seemed to come alive at night. Sarah began to notice the wallpaper on the walls cracking, although there was no reason for it to do so. Sometimes she would hear things falling in the kitchen, but when she got there, she would find nothing. Jack became increasingly irritable, but could not explain what was bothering him. He started having headaches that he had never had before. One evening, Sarah decided to talk to the realtor, but he was unavailable. She was surprised that the office where they had made the deal now looked closed. She tried to find information about the previous owners of the house, but came up empty. All data related to the place seemed to have been erased. This was only the beginning. The house had its secrets, and it wasn't going to let the Bennett family live in peace. Sarah realized that they had made a fatal mistake, but she didn't know how dearly they would have to pay for it. The first days in their new home seemed chaotic, but full of hope. The Bennett family put all their energy into unpacking, cleaning, and trying to create comfort in this spacious but gloomy mansion. However, in the midst of this chaotic turmoil, the first strange signs began to appear. At first, it seemed to be just a coincidence, a trifle that could be ignored. But with each passing day, the feeling that the house was taking on a life of its own grew stronger. One morning, Sarah woke up before everyone else and noticed that the kitchen table had been moved to the side. Jack had fixed it on purpose last night to avoid squeaking. She silently moved it back into place, blaming it on one of the children. However, Tom and Emily were still asleep, and Jack later assured her that he had not touched the table. That same evening, as Sarah was cleaning up the dirty dishes after dinner, she noticed that the chairs they had placed around the table were now arranged in a chaotic manner. No one was entering the kitchen after everyone had sat down in the living room. She tried to arrange it more comfortably, but the cold that suddenly enveloped the room made her hurry. A few days later, Jack was washing his face in the upstairs bathroom when he noticed the foggy mirror. In the foggy layer of moisture, he noticed fingerprints. They were randomly arranged, as if someone had run their hand over the surface. He wiped them off with a towel and thought they were leftovers from the children, but there was not yet enough moisture in the house for the mirrors to sweat on their own. The next morning, the situation repeated itself. This time, the prints looked clearer and formed something like letters, but they were so unclear that Jack decided to ignore them. He didn't want to scare Sarah, who had been looking tense lately. Tom and Emily began to complain about strange noises coming at night. Tom, who had a sensitive sleep pattern, claimed to hear someone walking slowly down the second-floor hallways. He tried to explain it away by saying that it must be Dad or Mom checking on them in their sleep. However, one day, when he woke up to these footsteps, he saw that his room door was closed and a shadow was visible behind it. Emily woke up every night at the same time, exactly at 3 o'clock. Her room was the smallest and closest to the stairs, so she heard the sounds most often. She told her mother that she heard whispers, but could not make out what they were saying. When Sarah stayed in her room one night to reassure her daughter, she also woke up at 3 a.m. She felt as if someone was in the room, even though the lamp she had turned on did not illuminate anything. Later, the incidents of moving objects became so frequent that it was impossible to ignore them. The keys that Sarah left on the table at the entrance were now in a completely different room. Books that Jack had put on the shelf in his study ended up on the floor, even though there were no drafts or animals in the house. When they returned home, they found open doors in the closets that they had closed in the morning. One night, while Jack was working late in his study, he heard a strange sound coming from the wall. It was a soft whisper, like a child's voice, saying words he couldn't make out. At first, Jack thought he was tired and imagining things. But when he got closer to the wall, the sound became clearer. It came again and stopped as suddenly as it had started. The next day, Sarah also noticed that the sound in the walls was following her. In the kitchen, while preparing lunch, she clearly heard someone whispering her name. She stopped, looked around, but saw no one. The windows were closed, the children were asleep, and Jack had gone into town to do some shopping. This incident made her so scared that she could not stay in the house alone. The creepiest thing was the appearance of handprints. They appeared on the windows and mirrors, and every night there were more of them. The prints looked too big for children's and too small for adults. Sarah tried to wipe them off, but the next morning they would come back. One day, she noticed that the prints were leading from the window on the second floor to her bed. Jack, trying to explain everything rationally, started checking the locks and windows, but they were locked. He decided to order an alarm system to make sure that no one else was entering the house. But even after that, the footprints appeared again. The Bennett family was trapped. They could no longer explain these events logically, but they also did not dare to tell anyone else about it. The house seemed to be gradually taking over their peace, and every night the fear grew stronger. This was only the beginning of their nightmare, and each of them began to feel that something invisible but terrifying would not allow them to leave this house. The house haunted the family. Every day, they realized more and more that this place was hiding something dark, something that seemed to be following them. But the most ominous thing was that they could not find an explanation for the events that took place here. The basement raised especially many questions. The heavy wooden door to it was always locked. Jack, armed with tools, decided to open it, but the lock did not seem to give in. He eventually gave up the idea, but every day the feeling that the main secret of the house was hidden behind this door was getting stronger. The basement began to breathe its own life. Sometimes faint sounds would come from under the door, a whisper, like a distant hum of voices. Sometimes Sarah could feel a light, cold breeze coming through the cracks, even though there was no ventilation. One evening, as she was passing by, she saw a wet trail on the floor in front of the door, like the prints of bare feet. She didn't know what to do, but she felt fear gradually take over her mind. Unable to bear the unknown, Sarah decided to find more information about the house. She went to the local library to research the history of the estate. The archives told her some terrifying details. The house was built in the late 19th century by the wealthy Willow family. The Willows were known for their seclusion, and the town often gossiped about the strange rituals that were rumored to have taken place in the house. Records contained references to a number of disappearances that occurred at the time. Several workers who were working on expanding the basement disappeared without a trace. The police found no evidence at the time, but the Willow family quickly sold the house and disappeared. The next owners left the house one by one, each time reporting unknown events. Sarah's special attention was drawn to an old newspaper that mentioned the tragic death of a child. A boy from the Willow family died under mysterious circumstances, and his body was never found. The article mentioned rumors that the basement was the scene of this tragedy. After reading this, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She realized that the answer she was looking for could be much more frightening than she had imagined. Meanwhile, Back at the house, things were becoming more and more unexplainable. Emily began to see silhouettes on the stairs, and Tom woke up one night and said he heard someone banging on the wall from the other side. Sarah tried to protect her children, reassuring them, but each new night brought new fears. One night, Jack decided to open the door to the basement. Armed with a heavy crowbar, he worked on the lock for a long time until it finally gave way. Behind the door was a dark passage leading down into the depths of the house. The smell of dampness and decay filled the air, causing each of them to feel a barely contained panic. The stairs were narrow and creaky, and the lamp Jack had brought only partially lit the way. The basement seemed larger than they had expected. The ceiling was low, and the walls were covered with fungus and black mold. In the corner of the room, they found an old chest. It was covered with a thick layer of dust, but the lock, surprisingly, looked new. When they opened the chest, there were old photographs, yellowed pages, and a worn diary inside. One of the photos showed the Willow family. Their faces seemed blurred, but their eyes looked straight at them as if through time. The diary contained entries that described rituals performed in the house. Each line breathed fear and despair, as if the person who wrote it knew what was coming. After the family returned upstairs, the situation began to escalate. Everyone felt that the house had changed. Now it seemed alive, and every corner breathed hostility. The shadows in the corridors became thicker. Sometimes they seemed to reach out to the residents. Emily could no longer sleep in her room, and Tom refused to talk about what he had seen. Sarah reread the notes she had found, trying to find some kind of answer. She realized that the rituals that took place in the house were aimed at summoning something inhuman. One of the entries spoke of a dark entity that needed victims. This entity, according to the author of the diary, would never leave the house. Meanwhile, Jack decided to try to lock the basement door. He closed it again and secured it with metal bars, but this did not stop the events. One night, the whole family woke up to a loud knocking sound, as if someone was trying to get out of the basement with great force. The sound stopped as suddenly as they had started, but a mark on the door, like a large handprint, remained. The Bennett family began to realize that this place would not let them go so easily. Although their fear grew with each passing day, they felt that they were now part of this house, its history, its dark soul. Sarah knew it was just beginning. After discovering the basement and finding evidence of the house's horrific past, the Bennett family's life turned into a nightmare. The very atmosphere of the house changed. The air became heavy, and the darkness in the corners began to seem almost tangible. Everyone realized that their fear had become food for something that inhabited the house. Emily stopped leaving her room. She sat in her bed, clutching an old toy she had brought from her previous home. She no longer spoke to her brother or parents, only whispering incomprehensible things from time to time, turning to the darkness. Tom started seeing strange figures in the mirrors. He claimed they were watching him, even when the room was empty. Jack tried to keep everything under control. He thought he could protect his family. By replacing the locks and reinforcing the windows, he hoped it would ease their fears at least a little. But the house had no intention of stopping. One evening, when he was alone in the living room, the lamp began to flicker and a faint, barely perceptible movement appeared from the corner of the room. It was a shadow, but it had the distinct outline of a person. Jack felt his body break out in a cold sweat, but he could not take his eyes off the phenomenon. One night, what everyone feared happened. Tom disappeared. Everything in his room looked as if he had just stepped out for a minute. The bed was neatly made and the toys were still in their places. But he was nowhere to be found. Sarah and Jack searched the entire house, but to no avail. When Jack went downstairs to the basement, he was terrified. The door, which he had closed with strong metal bars, was open. On the floor were footprints leading into the depths of darkness. Jack could hear something creaking and rustling in the distance, but he did not dare to go any further. Sarah, filled with despair, blamed herself for bringing her family to this house. She was constantly haunted by the feeling that she was responsible for everything that was happening. But she knew one thing. If they didn't find Tom, he might stay in that house forever. After Tom disappeared, the house began to act even more aggressively. At night, whispers filled the corridors, and the shadows in the rooms grew thicker and moved on their own. Jack and Sarah could not sleep. Every sound seemed to be a threat, every movement a harbinger of even greater misfortune. Emily, who had previously whispered only to herself, now began to speak out loud. She said that Tom was still here, that he was talking to her. She claimed to hear his voice in the basement, and that he was asking for help. Sarah tried to calm her daughter down, but her eyes were full of anxiety. She no longer knew where fiction ended and reality began. One evening, when the whole family was gathered in the living room, the door to the basement suddenly opened by itself. The opening was accompanied by a loud crash that seemed impossible for a simple tree. There was a chill from the inside, and quiet laughter could be heard, childish but distorted. Jack decided it was time to act. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he went down to the basement, despite Sarah's protests. The basement greeted him with pitch blackness, and every step echoed. It seemed that the space was changing, becoming larger and more alien. He passed the old chest they had opened earlier, but now it was empty. Something was moving in the corner of the room, but when he shone his flashlight, no one was there. Suddenly, Jack heard Tom's voice. He was calling him, asking for help. He ran toward the sound, but instead of his son, he saw a shadow stretching toward him and disappearing into the wall. Feeling panicked, Jack hurried back upstairs. When Jack came out of the basement, he realized that the house had completely lost all connection with reality. The wallpaper on the walls was cracking and falling. The floor seemed alive, and the windows now showed only the thick darkness outside. Sarah and Emily stood at the front door, which they could not open, even though Jack was trying his best to kick it in with a crowbar. A feeling of helplessness gripped them all. The house was not just locking them inside. It was playing with them, drawing out their fears and feeding on their despair. Sarah realized that they had become part of this place, and now the house would not let them go. On the last night, the family gathered together, not knowing what to do. They heard a loud rumble coming from the basement. A sound like huge hands hitting the walls filled the house. The shadows around them began to move, enveloping the room. And then the basement door opened again, releasing the darkness that swallowed them all. The house that had become a prison for the Bennett family continued to strengthen its hold on them with each passing day. After the night when darkness swallowed the basement, it seemed that the very space around them no longer obeyed the laws of reality. The windows now showed only pitch blackness, even during the day. The clocks stopped at different marks, and the mirrors began to reflect rooms that did not exist. Sarah, Jack, and Emily realized that they were all alone in this nightmare. They could no longer see a way to escape. The shadows that had only watched before were now stalking them. They did not just stay in the corners. They reached out to people, trying to touch their skin. Every night became a test, every sound a threat. Emily increasingly said she heard voices calling her to the basement. She became even more silent and alienated, and her eyes seemed to lose their light. Sarah tried to keep her daughter close, but at night she felt as if something was trying to take her right out of bed. One day, she woke up in the middle of the night and saw a figure leaning over Emily in the dark. She rushed to her daughter's side, but when she turned on the light, she saw only an empty room. Jack, exhausted by sleepless nights and constant fear, decided to find a way out, even if it meant facing the basement again. He took a flashlight and an axe, ready to fight whatever was waiting for him down there. But when he went down, he found only emptiness. The basement space had changed, becoming endless and maze-like. Jack returned, but the door closed behind him, and he could no longer find his way back. Sarah was left alone with Emily. She realized that the house was trying to finish what it had started. Every room was now hostile. The floor creaked and parted, the walls whispered something unintelligible, and the windows showed figures standing outside waiting. She didn't know what had happened to Jack, but there was hope in her heart that he was still fighting somewhere in the darkness. Emily, who no longer spoke, just looked at her mother with a strange expression. She got up and walked to the basement door, as if answering an invisible call. Sarah tried to stop her, but felt her own body become heavy and immobile. The darkness that emanated from the basement enveloped Emily, and the door slammed shut with a loud bang. Sarah was left alone. She sat in the empty house, listening to the walls breathe silently. She was overcome with the feeling that the house had gotten everything it wanted. The space around her became cold, and the sounds faded away. She realized that now she too had become a part of this place, its history, its endless darkness. A few months later, the locals noticed that the house was up for sale again. The real estate agent assured them that the new residents had simply decided to move out. But no one saw the Bennetts leave the house. Rumors began to spread. Some said they had left at night, others that the house had simply eaten them. From the windows, it sometimes seemed that figures were visible, standing and watching what was happening outside. Locals avoided the place, but there were new potential buyers who were interested in the old Victorian house. And each of them later learned that this property hides more than meets the eye. The house continued to live its own life, attracting new residents who, like the Bennetts, were looking for a new beginning. And each time, it changed their reality, turning them into part of its endless story.